The late autumn wind swept across the grounds of Ashbourne Hall with a mournful whisper, stripping the last bronze leaves from ancient oaks that had witnessed generations of weddings far happier than this one. Lady Eleanor Pemberton stood before the gilt mirror, in what was now her dressing chamber, her reflection pale against the heavy ivory silk of her wedding gown, and wondered if a bride had ever felt more alone on what should have been the most joyous day of her life. The seamstresses had outdone themselves with seed pearls and Belgian lace, creating a masterpiece befitting the daughter of one of England's wealthiest merchants. Yet the gown felt like a costume for a role she had not auditioned for, but must now play for the remainder of her days. Beyond the leaded windows, she could see the estate that her fortune had already begun to restore, the crumbling east wing now scaffolded with new timber, the overgrown gardens gradually yielding to skilled hands her money had hired. All of it a monument to a transaction everyone understood but politely refused to name. Her father had been dead only 3 months when the Duke of Ashbourne's man of business had first called, and Eleanor had known immediately what such interest portended, for the Duke's situation was as notorious as his beauty. They said he possessed a face that could have launched 1,000 ships had he been born Helen instead of Ashbourne, with eyes the colour of storm clouds over the moors, and a bearing that spoke of centuries of breeding, even as his coffers echoed with emptiness. The ceremony itself had been brief and correct, held in the estate's chapel with only the necessary witnesses, the Duke's voice steady as he spoke vows that bound him to her in law if not in heart, her own responses barely above a whisper as she promised to honour a man who had chosen her for her late father's shipping fortune rather than any quality residing within her own person. He had looked at her exactly once during the entire service, his expression perfectly composed and utterly unreadable, before turning his attention back to the Archbishop with the same detached politeness one might afford a banker finalizing a particularly advantageous loan. The wedding breakfast had been equally formal, conversation flowing around safe topics of weather and estate improvements, while the undercurrent of what everyone knew hummed beneath each pleasantry, like a bass note no one would acknowledge. Now, as evening settled over Ashbourne Hall and Eleanor found herself standing in the Duchess's chambers, she heard the Duke's footsteps pause outside her door for the briefest moment, before continuing down the corridor to his own apartments, the distance between their rooms a physical manifestation of the chasm between their hearts. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that despite the mercenary origins of their union, some small warmth might exist between them, some possibility of companionship if not love. But as she stood alone in rooms decorated with exquisite taste and empty of all affection, Eleanor understood with crushing clarity that she had traded her inheritance for a title and a husband who would never see her as anything more than the fortune that had saved him from ruin. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern as predictable as it was painful. Each day, a careful choreography of polite avoidance that left Eleanor wondering if loneliness could actually be more profound when one lived in the same house as its source. The Duke maintained a schedule of impeccable regularity, rising before dawn for his solitary rides across the estate's restored grounds, breakfasting alone in his study while reviewing correspondence, spending his afternoons managing tenant concerns with a dedication that surprised her, and retiring each evening to the library, where he remained until well past the hour. Eleanor herself sought her empty bed. She had thrown herself into the role of Duchess, with a determination born of necessity, meeting with the housekeeper each morning to review household accounts, consulting with the head gardener about the restoration of the long-neglected rose gardens, approving menus and organizing the staff with an efficiency that won their respect even as she knew they pitied her situation. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper who had served the Ashbourne family for 30 years, had a way of sighing when she thought Eleanor couldn't hear, and the maids exchanged knowing glances when the Duke passed through rooms without acknowledging his wife's presence beyond the briefest of nods. Everyone knew, of course, that theirs was a marriage of convenience rather than affection, that her late father's shipping fortune had purchased a title and estate, while the Duke had sold his ancient name to stave off complete ruin. But knowing a thing and living within its reality were vastly different experiences. Eleanor found herself observing him from windows and doorways like some Gothic heroine in a penny dreadful, watching the way sunlight caught in his dark hair during his morning rides, noting how his shoulders relaxed when he thought himself unobserved in the library, cataloguing these small glimpses of the man behind the title as though they were treasures she might hoard against the poverty of their actual interactions. It was during one such instance of unintentional observation that she discovered him reading poetry, standing in the library doorway with correspondence she'd meant to leave on his desk when she saw him absorbed in what appeared to be Wordsworth. His usual mask of cool composure softened into something approaching genuine feeling as his fingers traced the words on the page. He had looked up then, caught her watching, and for the span of 3 heartbeats, something flickered in those storm-cloud eyes before the shutters came down again, and he offered her the same courteous nod he might give a passing acquaintance before returning his attention to the book, as though she had already ceased to exist. Eleanor had retreated to her rooms that evening, and wept for reasons she could not entirely articulate, mourning not what she had lost, but what she feared she might never have. The growing realization settling in her chest like a stone that she was developing feelings for a man who would forever see her as nothing more than the fortune that had saved him from debtor's prison. Winter descended upon Ashbourne Hall with a fury that seemed to mirror the frost between its Duke and Duchess, snow piling against the ancient stones, while ice formed intricate patterns on window panes that might have been beautiful had Eleanor possessed anyone with whom to share their observation. The shortest days of the year found her increasingly isolated, for the weather made even her daily walks impossible, confining her to the house where every corridor seemed designed to facilitate the Duke's avoidance of her company, their encounters reduced to chance passings, where he would bow with mechanical courtesy before disappearing into whichever room she was not occupying. It was during a particularly vicious storm in late December that circumstance finally forced what months of proximity had not, the wind howling like something alive and vengeful as it battered the estate, driving snow through every crack and crevice until the servants found themselves overwhelmed with simply keeping the fires lit and the vital rooms habitable. Mrs. Davies appeared in Eleanor's sitting room that evening with an expression caught between apology and something that might have been hope, explaining that the storm had made it impossible to prepare separate meals in both the formal dining room and the Duke's study, and would Her Grace consent to taking dinner with His Grace in the smaller family dining room, where a single fire might adequately warm them both. Eleanor's heart had performed an acrobatic feat at the prospect, terror and longing braiding together as she allowed herself to be dressed for dinner, as though preparing for battle, descending the stairs to find the Duke already present, standing by the fire with his back to her until he sensed her entrance, and turned with that same careful courtesy that had become armor against any genuine connection. The meal began in excruciating silence, broken only by the clatter of silverware and the storm's relentless assault on the windows. But somewhere between the second and third courses, Eleanor made a desperate comment about the book she had been reading, a translation of Dante that she had found in the library, and watched something flicker behind the Duke's carefully maintained facade. He had read it as well, it seemed, and held opinions about the translator's choices that he expressed with an eloquence and passion entirely absent from his usual monosyllabic responses to her attempts at conversation, and before Eleanor quite understood how it had happened, they were engaged in genuine discourse about poetry and translation, about the difference between literal accuracy and emotional truth, about the books that had shaped their respective understandings of the world. For perhaps an hour, the Duke's mask slipped sufficiently that she glimpsed the man beneath, intelligent and thoughtful and possessed of depths she had only suspected, before he seemed to recall himself, and the warmth drained from his expression like water through a sieve, leaving only the polite stranger who bid her good evening and retreated to his chambers as though their conversation had never occurred. Eleanor lay awake that night, replaying every word, every momentary softening of his features, hope kindling in her chest despite her efforts to extinguish it, for she understood she was falling in love with a man who had purchased her fortune and wanted nothing of her heart. In the days that followed, she began a campaign so subtle she barely acknowledged it to herself, leaving books she thought might interest him in the library, volumes on subjects they had discussed or authors he had mentioned, admiring, never with a note or acknowledgement, but simply present where he might find them. And though he never spoke of these offerings, she noticed they moved from where she had placed them, their spines showing the telltale signs of having been opened and read. In these silent exchanges, the closest thing to intimacy their marriage had yet achieved, even as Eleanor's heart broke a little more each day with loving someone who saw her as nothing more than the transaction that had saved his ancestral home from ruin. The Christmas season descended upon London society with its customary glitter and obligation, transforming the city into a stage upon which marriages, both genuine and mercenary, performed their carefully rehearsed productions, and Eleanor found herself thrust into this theatre of artifice, with a dread that sat like lead in her stomach as she prepared for the Marchioness of Pemberton's annual ball, the first major social event she and the Duke would attend as a married couple. The Duke had appeared at her dressing-room door that evening, looking devastatingly handsome in his formal attire, offering his arm with that same careful courtesy that had become the hallmark of their interaction, and together they had descended to the waiting carriage, like actors taking their positions for a performance neither had rehearsed. The silence between them during the journey, broken only by the clatter of wheels on cobblestones and the distant sound of bells, celebrating a season of joy that felt bitterly ironic given the emptiness of their union. At the ball, however, everything transformed with a precision that would have been impressive had it not been so painful, for the Duke became suddenly attentive in ways that made Eleanor's breath catch, even as her mind catalogued each gesture as performance rather than genuine affection. In his hand at the small of her back as they greeted their hostess, the way he leaned close to murmur observations about the other guests, the solicitude with which he ensured her glass was never empty and her dance card appropriately filled, all of it precisely calibrated to present the image of a devoted husband while his eyes remained as distant as winter stars. She had excused herself to the ladies' retiring room near midnight, desperate for a moment away from the exquisite torture of his proximity, and it was there, separated from the ballroom by only a velvet curtain and poor acoustics, that she overheard Lady Hartsworth and her circle discussing the Ashbourne marriage with the gleeful cruelty that passed for entertainment among certain members of the ton, their voices carrying clearly as they dissected how the Duke had sold himself to trade, how Eleanor must know she had purchased a title rather than earned a husband's devotion, how pathetic it was to watch her try to pretend otherwise when everyone knew the truth of their arrangement. Eleanor had frozen with her hand on the curtain, humiliation burning through her like fever, but before she could gather herself to flee, another voice cut through the gossip with the precision of a blade, the Duke's tone carrying an edge she had never heard, as he demolished Lady Hartsworth's character with such surgical accuracy that the woman's protests died unspoken, his defense of Eleanor's honor and character delivered with a cold fury that left no doubt he would tolerate no disrespect toward his Duchess, regardless of the circumstances of their marriage. When Eleanor finally emerged, shaken and confused, she found him across the ballroom, and their eyes met in a moment that seemed to stop time itself, his expression unreadable, but something burning in those grey depths that made her heart perform acrobatics against her ribs before he looked away, and the mask descended once more. They returned to Ashbourne Hall in silence that night, the carriage journey an exercise in sustained tension, but when he handed her down and bid her good night, his fingers lingered against hers for perhaps 3 seconds longer than strictly necessary, and Eleanor lay awake until dawn, trying to reconcile the man who defended her honor with such passion, with the husband who could barely bring himself to share a room with her, understanding only that something fundamental had shifted between them, even if she could not yet name what transformation had begun. Spring arrived at Ashbourne Hall with a tentative warmth that seemed to promise renewal, the first crocuses pushing through the last remnants of snow like small acts of defiance against winter's lingering grip. But Eleanor barely noticed the changing season, as she found herself consumed by a fever that struck with devastating swiftness in early March, transforming her from merely lonely to genuinely ill within the span of a single day. The physician was summoned immediately, his grave expression as he emerged from her chambers, sending Mrs. Davies into a flurry of activity, and the Duke was informed with the same careful formality that marked all communication between master and mistress, receiving the news of his wife's condition with that impenetrable composure that had become his constant shield against feeling anything too deeply. He visited her chambers twice daily with mechanical precision, standing at the foot of her bed for exactly the appropriate duration, while Mrs. Davies reported on her condition, his face a mask of polite concern that revealed nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those grey eyes, and Eleanor, floating in and out of fever-induced delirium, registered his presence as one might note a stranger's courtesy rather than a husband's care. But Mrs. Davies, who had served the Ashbourne family for 3 decades and possessed the particular wisdom that comes from observing human nature in all its contradictions, he noticed what neither the Duke nor Eleanor could acknowledge: how his Grace would depart Eleanor's chambers only to pace the corridor outside her door for hours, how the shadows beneath his eyes deepened with each passing night, how he could be found at odd hours standing outside her rooms as though proximity alone might will her back to health, even if he could not bring himself to offer the comfort of his actual presence. It was during the worst night of the fever, when Eleanor's temperature climbed to dangerous heights, and the physician warned they must prepare for any outcome, that her delirium finally stripped away the careful guards she had maintained around her heart, and she spoke aloud the truths she had hidden even from herself, her voice breaking as she confessed to the empty air about the loneliness that consumed her, about loving a man who saw her as nothing more than the fortune he had married, about the exquisite torture of proximity without intimacy, about wishing she had never agreed to this arrangement if it meant spending her life wanting someone who would never want her in return. The Duke, who had been standing in the corridor, as had become his nightly vigil, heard every word through the door Mrs. Davies had left slightly ajar, and something fundamental shattered within him as he listened to his wife's fevered confessions, the careful architecture of distance and propriety he had constructed, crumbling like a sand castle before the tide. He entered her chambers without conscious decision, dismissing the startled nurse with a gesture, and took up the chair beside Eleanor's bed, where he remained through the long hours of darkness, holding her hand with a tenderness he had never permitted himself to show while she was conscious, murmuring reassurances she would not remember, his thumb tracing circles on her palm as though he might anchor her to life through touch alone. When dawn finally broke and the fever turned, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open to find herself alone once more, the Duke having retreated to his own chambers before she could wake, but the ghost of warmth remained in her hand where his had been, and though she could not be certain whether those memories of comfort were real or fever dream, something in her heart insisted they had happened, that for one night at least, the distance between them had dissolved, even if morning had restored it with all its former rigidity, leaving Eleanor to wonder whether the warmth of his hand holding hers had been real or merely the kindest lie her fevered mind could construct to ease the pain of loving someone who would never love her back. The Duke of Ashbourne stood at the window of his study in the grey hours before dawn, watching the gardens where Eleanor would soon walk among the spring flowers she had planted with such care, and the self-loathing that had become his constant companion settled over him like a shroud, as he contemplated the wreckage he had made of both their lives through his mercenary choices and subsequent cowardice. He had married her for money, there was no escaping that fundamental truth, had stood at the altar and spoken vows he had no right to make, while calculating how her fortune would restore his estate and save his family's legacy. And though he had told himself at the time that such arrangements were common among their class, that she understood the transaction as clearly as he did, the memory of his own coldness on their wedding night burned like acid in his throat. What he had not anticipated, what his cynical heart had not prepared for, was the slow revelation of Eleanor's character in the months that followed, the quiet dignity with which she managed his household, the gentleness she showed to servants who had known only his mother's harsh temperament, the way she transformed the cold halls of Ashbourne into something approaching a home through small acts of beauty and care that spoke of a generous spirit he had done nothing to deserve. He had noticed the books she left for him in the library, each one chosen with an understanding of his tastes that suggested she had been observing him far more carefully than he had realized, and though pride and shame had prevented him from acknowledging her gestures, he had read every volume, sometimes finding passages marked that seemed to speak directly to the loneliness he imagined she must feel in this marriage of convenience. The night of her illness had destroyed whatever careful distance he had managed to maintain, her fevered confessions revealing a depth of feeling that both exalted and devastated him, for how could he deserve the love of a woman whose fortune he had married, whose isolation he had enforced through his own emotional cowardice, whose gentle heart he had systematically broken through months of deliberate coldness masquerading as propriety? He loved her, God help him, had perhaps begun loving her when he watched her plant those first bulbs in the autumn garden with dirt on her hands and hope in her eyes, had certainly loved her by the winter ball, when hearing her name disparaged had filled him with a rage that had shocked him with its intensity. But what right had he to such feelings when he had purchased her, like one might purchase livestock, and then condemned her to a half-life of polite neglect? Each morning he watched her from this window as she moved through the gardens, her grace and solitude a rebuke to his unworthiness, and he understood with bitter clarity that she deserved so much more than a fortune hunter who had trapped her in a loveless marriage. Deserved a man who had courted her properly, who had won her heart rather than bought her hand, who could offer her devotion untainted by the mercenary circumstances of their union. The only honorable course, he had decided in the sleepless hours after her fever broke, was to maintain the distance that would protect her from the indignity of being loved by someone as unworthy as himself, and to give her at least the dignity of a respectful arrangement, even if he could not give her the freedom she deserved. Though each day of such restraint felt like dying by degrees, a slow suffocation of every tender impulse that rose in him when she entered a room or smiled at something in her correspondence, or hummed softly while arranging flowers in the hall. The weeks that followed Eleanor's recovery settled into a rhythm of such exquisite torment that both the Duke and his wife moved through Ashbourne Hall like ghosts haunting the same beautiful prison, each acutely aware of the other's presence, yet separated by walls of pride and pain that seemed to grow higher with each passing day. Eleanor threw herself into the care of the estate with an almost desperate energy, spending long hours in the gardens she had designed, her hands deep in the soil as she planted roses and lavender and all manner of growing things, as though she might cultivate in the earth the love that withered between her and her husband. And the servants who watched her work with worried eyes whispered among themselves that the Duchess was pouring her heart into the land because she had nowhere else to give it. The Duke, for his part, buried himself in the practical management of the estate with a single-mindedness that bordered on obsession, working alongside tenants in the fields until his hands blistered and his back ached, seeking in physical exhaustion some respite from the emotional torment that consumed him whenever he allowed himself to be still. And more than once the estate manager found his Grace alone in the stables at dawn, already having been there for hours, though what he did in those dark hours none could say. Mrs. Davies observed them both with the particular sadness of one who sees two people drowning within arm's reach of each other, neither able to bridge the small distance that separated them, and she confided to the housekeeper that in all her years at Ashbourne she had never witnessed such mutual misery. For at least the late Duke and Duchess had possessed the cold comfort of genuine indifference, whereas the current master and mistress suffered from caring too much, while believing themselves unworthy of the caring. There came an afternoon in late April, when Eleanor and the Duke found themselves alone in the morning room quite by accident, she having come to review the week's menus, and he to examine some papers regarding the tenant farms, and for a moment they both froze, caught in that terrible proximity that made their separation all the more painful, the spring sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the careful distance they maintained, even as their eyes met with an intensity that spoke of everything they refused to say aloud. The Duke opened his mouth as though he might finally speak the truth that burned in his chest, and Eleanor took half a step toward him, with her hand rising unconsciously toward his face, but then the moment shattered as it always did, broken by the weight of guilt and unworthiness on his side and fear of rejection on hers, and they retreated to their respective corners with murmured apologies for the intrusion, leaving the morning room empty save for the ghost of what might have been. It was that very evening that Eleanor, sitting alone in her chambers with her mother's letters spread before her, began to compose a letter to her aunt in Cornwall, inquiring with careful casualness about the possibility of an extended visit, perhaps even a permanent residence, for surely anything would be better than this slow death by proximity to a man she loved, who would never love her in return. And she had nearly finished the letter when she heard footsteps pause outside her door. A presence she knew without seeing was the Duke, standing in the corridor as he sometimes did, neither entering nor leaving, just existing in that liminal space that seemed to define their entire marriage. The Duke, on the other side of that door, had heard the scratch of her pen, and somehow known with terrible certainty that she was writing herself an escape from Ashbourne, from him, and the devastation that knowledge brought felt like a physical wound, for he had told himself that maintaining distance was protecting her, but now he understood it was driving her away, Yet still he could not move, he could not knock, could not bridge the gap that his own unworthiness had created, and so they remained separated by a door and by everything they could not say. Two people suffering parallel loneliness in a house that had never felt more empty, despite their shared occupation of its rooms, neither understanding that the other suffered just as deeply, neither able to imagine that the love they believed unreturned was in fact a mirror of their own desperate devotion. And the spring night deepened around them both, beautiful and indifferent to their pain, while somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour and marked another day lost to the cruel geometry of two hearts that beat in isolation, though they existed mere feet apart. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early May, when the apple blossoms were at their peak, and the world seemed determined to mock Eleanor's internal desolation with its beauty. Delivered by a grim-faced messenger who waited with obvious discomfort while she signed for the correspondence from her family's solicitor in London, and even before she broke the seal, Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, for nothing good had ever come from Mr. Pemberton's communications since her father's death had set in motion the slow unraveling of her family's financial security. She read the letter once in disbelief, then again with growing horror as the words arranged themselves into an undeniable reality that seemed to tilt the world on its axis, for her Uncle Thomas, to whom the remnants of the Pemberton fortune had been entrusted after the marriage settlements were complete, had proven himself spectacularly unworthy of that trust through a combination of poor investments, gambling debts, and a series of legal entanglements that Mr. Pemberton described with the careful language of a man trying to soften a devastating blow. The fortune that had not already been transferred to restore Ashbourne Hall was gone, consumed entirely by her uncle's profligacy and the subsequent legal battles to recover even a fraction of what had been lost, and while her marriage settlement remained intact by virtue of having been legally separated from the family assets, there would be nothing more, no inheritance to provide her with independence, no family wealth to fall back upon should she ever need it, nothing but what she had already given to save the estate of a man who had married her for money that no longer existed. Eleanor sat in the morning room with the letter trembling in her hands and felt the foundations of her world crumble beneath her. For if she had been trapped before by circumstance and her own inconvenient feelings, she was now trapped absolutely, wholly dependent on the charity of a husband who had wanted her for a fortune she no longer possessed. And the fear that rose in her throat tasted of bile and desperation as she imagined his reaction to this news. She knew she had to tell him, could not possibly conceal such information, even if propriety and law did not demand its disclosure, but the thought of walking to his study and confessing her complete financial ruin made her feel physically ill. For what would he do when he learned that his mercenary marriage had purchased him nothing in the end, that the wife he had acquired for her wealth was now as penniless as any common girl, worth nothing beyond the settlement he could not reclaim? For hours she sat frozen with the letter in her lap, watching the shadows lengthen across the polished floors, while her mind conjured increasingly terrible scenarios of his response, imagining cold dismissal, or barely concealed contempt, or perhaps simply the final severing of whatever thin connection had existed between them. And it was only as the dinner hour approached, and she knew she could delay no longer, that Eleanor finally rose on shaking legs, smoothed her dress with hands that would not stop trembling, and walked with what dignity she could muster toward the Duke's study to face what she believed would be her ruin. She paused outside his door and pressed her palm against the dark wood, gathering the fragments of her courage like a general preparing for certain defeat, and then she knocked, heard his voice bid her enter, and stepped across the threshold into the conversation she had been dreading, carrying with her the letter that she believed would destroy whatever fragile peace they had managed to maintain in their beautiful, terrible marriage. The Duke looked up from his papers as Eleanor entered, and whatever composure she had managed to gather in the corridor evaporated under his gaze, leaving her standing just inside the door with the solicitor's letter clutched in her trembling hands, like evidence of her own inadequacy, and she opened her mouth to speak, but found that the carefully prepared words had fled, replaced by a terrible silence that stretched between them, until finally she simply held out the letter with a gesture of such defeat that he rose immediately from his desk and crossed to her with an expression she could not read. He took the letter and read it while she stood frozen, watching his face for the anger or disappointment or cold dismissal she knew must come, her heart pounding so violently she felt certain he must hear it, and when he finally looked up from the page, his expression was so utterly unexpected that for a moment she could not comprehend it. For there was no fury in his eyes, no contempt, but rather something that looked almost like relief, though that made no sense when she had just confessed her complete financial ruin. Eleanor forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, as she said, "I am destitute, Your Grace. Beyond what the marriage settlement provides, there is nothing left of my family's fortune. My uncle has destroyed it all, and I thought you should know that the wife you married for her wealth is now worth precisely nothing." And she hated the way her voice broke on the final word, hated showing such vulnerability when she had promised herself she would face this with dignity. The Duke set the letter aside with a careful deliberation that seemed at odds with the intensity in his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a roughness she had never heard before as he said, "Worth nothing? Eleanor, you believe your worth is measured in pounds and property," and she flinched at the question, uncertain whether it was rhetorical or whether he expected an answer, her confusion deepening when he continued, "I have spent these months believing you tolerated my presence only because this marriage provided you security, that you remained at Ashbourne out of duty or necessity, rather than any genuine desire to be here, and now you tell me the money is gone, and I find myself grateful, relieved beyond measure, because now at least I know that if you stay, it cannot be for the estate or the title or anything beyond." But he trailed off, seeming to catch himself before revealing too much, and Eleanor stared at him in complete bewilderment, unable to reconcile his words with her expectations. He turned away from her, walking to the window with his hands clasped behind his back. In that particular posture, she had come to recognize as him wrestling with difficult emotions, and after a long moment he asked without looking at her, "Do you wish to leave, Eleanor? Now that the financial bonds are broken, do you wish to seek an annulment, to be free of this marriage that brought you nothing but isolation and loneliness?" And the question struck her with the force of a physical blow, for she had expected him to cast her out, not to offer her the choice, and she found herself unable to answer because the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. The silence that followed was charged with everything they could not say. Eleanor, standing in the center of his study, with her hands twisted in her skirts, and the Duke at the window, with his shoulders tense beneath his coat, two people circling around feelings so profound they dared not give them voice, and when he finally turned back to face her, his expression was carefully neutral except for his eyes, which held such intensity that Eleanor had to look away, her heart racing with hope and fear in equal measure, as she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them, though she could not yet name what it was or where it might lead, and the conversation ended without resolution, as he quietly excused himself, leaving her alone in his study with the letter that had seemed like the end of everything but might somehow, impossibly, be the beginning of something neither of them had dared to imagine. Eleanor slept poorly that night, her mind churning with the Duke's strange questions and stranger relief, and when morning came she dressed with mechanical precision while rehearsing speeches she knew she would never deliver, arguments for why she should stay that did not rely on the dangerous truth of her feelings. So when a maid arrived with a request for her presence in the Duke's study at her earliest convenience, Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure fracture like ice beneath an unexpected weight. She found him standing behind his desk, surrounded by papers that had clearly occupied him through the night, if the shadows beneath his eyes were any indication, and there was something in his bearing that reminded her of a soldier preparing for battle, a terrible determination mixed with resignation that made her heart clench with nameless dread, even before he gestured to the chair across from him and said in a voice carefully stripped of emotion, "Please sit. Eleanor, there are matters we must discuss that cannot wait." She sat because her legs would not hold her, watching as he organized the papers with hands that were not quite steady, and when he finally looked at her directly, she saw in his eyes such painful resolve that she braced herself for dismissal, for the ending she had feared since reading her uncle's letter. But what he said instead drove all thought from her mind as he began, "I have spent the night in consultation with my solicitors, arranging certain transfers that I should have executed long ago." He pushed the first document across the desk toward her, his finger pointing to text that seemed to swim before her eyes, as he explained with awful precision. "This is the deed to Ashbourne Hall and all its lands, which I am transferring entirely into your name, along with all properties, investments, and assets that were restored or acquired through your fortune. Everything that your money built or saved now belongs to you absolutely, with no claim from me beyond what you choose to grant." Eleanor stared at the paper as though it were written in a foreign language, her mind unable to grasp what he was proposing, and when she tried to speak, he raised a hand to forestall her objections and continued in that same carefully controlled voice. "I have retained only Millbrook and the small property in Derbyshire that came to me through my mother's family and was never touched by debt. It is modest, but sufficient for a gentleman to live quietly, and it will be enough for me." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward into implications Eleanor could not yet process, and she watched as he pushed forward additional documents, his explanations continuing with the methodical thoroughness of a man determined to complete an unpleasant task. Speaking of her absolute legal control, her freedom to manage or sell as she wished, her right to remain at Ashbourne without him or to dismiss him from her property entirely. When he finally paused, meeting her eyes with an expression that was equal parts anguish and determination, he said softly, "You deserve choice, Eleanor. You deserve freedom to build the life you want without being trapped by a marriage you never truly chose. And so I am giving you everything: the estate, your independence, the ability to divorce me if you wish, and keep all that should rightfully be yours, since it was your fortune that created it." She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her entire being focused on the man across from her who was offering her everything she should want: freedom and security and independence, while asking for nothing in return except perhaps her absence. And in that moment, Eleanor understood with crystalline clarity that this grand gesture was not born of obligation or guilt alone, but of something far more profound and painful, a kind of love that believed itself so unworthy it would destroy its own happiness to provide her with choice. And the realization broke something open in her chest, even as the papers sat between them, like a chasm too wide to cross. Eleanor fled the study with some murmured excuse about needing time to review the documents, though in truth she could not bear to remain in that room, with the weight of his sacrifice pressing down upon her like a physical force, and she found herself walking without conscious direction through the halls of Ashbourne, until her feet carried her to the gardens, where she had spent so many solitary hours, pouring her heart into the soil because she could not give it to the man she loved. The spring roses she had planted were beginning to bloom, their petals unfurling in shades of pink and cream that should have brought her joy, but instead seemed to mock her with their beauty, and she sank onto the stone bench beneath the trellis she had commissioned last summer, her mind reeling with the impossible generosity of what he had offered and the devastating implications beneath it. He had given her everything: every brick and beam of Ashbourne, every acre of land, every penny of income. He had stripped himself of all security and comfort to provide her with choice, and the magnitude of that gesture should have filled her with gratitude, except that she understood with terrible clarity what it truly meant, that he believed himself so unworthy of her that he would rather live in exile at a modest property in Derbyshire than continue to inflict his presence upon her. Eleanor pressed her hands to her face as the full truth of the situation crashed over her like a wave, for she had spent these months believing he saw her as nothing more than a convenient source of funds, while he had apparently spent the same months believing she tolerated him only out of duty or necessity, and they had both been wrong, so profoundly wrong that they had constructed an entire architecture of misery upon false foundations. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, except that tears were streaming down her face instead. Tears for all the wasted time, all the lonely nights, all the moments when they might have reached for each other, but instead retreated into their separate sorrows. And she thought of his hand holding hers through her illness, that single memory she had treasured like a talisman against despair, and wondered if he had any idea how that simple touch had sustained her through the months that followed. The documents he had presented her sat in his study waiting for her decision, offering her freedom and security and independence, everything a rational woman should want. But Eleanor found as she sat among her roses that she did not want any of those things, or rather she wanted them only if they came with him. For what good was owning Ashbourne if he was not there to walk its halls beside her? What joy could there be in freedom if it meant freedom from his presence? And she realized with a certainty that burned away all her careful defenses that she did not want to be released from this marriage, but rather released into it. Freed not from him, but from the terrible restraint that had kept them apart. But how could she tell him this, when his grand gesture seemed predicated on the assumption that she would want to leave? When accepting his offer might seem like the mercenary grasping of a woman securing her fortune, and yet refusing it without explanation would accomplish nothing except perhaps wounding his pride. And Eleanor sat frozen in her garden, paralyzed by the fear that any choice she made would be the wrong one and would drive him further away rather than drawing him closer, until she remembered the look in his eyes when he had asked if she wished to leave, that terrible vulnerability beneath his careful control, and she understood suddenly that he had not offered her these documents out of indifference, but out of a love so profound it was willing to sacrifice its own happiness for hers, and that realization changed everything. Eleanor rose from the garden bench as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the roses that seemed to mirror the lengthening shadows in her own heart, and she walked back toward the house with a determination born not of certainty, but of the desperate understanding that silence would destroy them both more surely than any confession could. She found him where she had left him hours ago, still in his study, though the papers had been gathered into neat stacks, as though he had been attempting to create order in the chaos of their situation, and when she entered without knocking, he looked up with such naked hope, quickly shuttered behind careful politeness, that she nearly lost her courage entirely. But she closed the door behind her and moved to stand before his desk, her hands trembling as she said without preamble, "I cannot accept these documents." His face went carefully blank in that way she had come to recognize as his deepest pain, and he began to speak, some formal acknowledgement of her right to take time to consider, but she raised a shaking hand to stop him and continued in a voice that threatened to break. "I cannot accept them because they offer me everything except the one thing I truly want, and I have spent too many months in silence, in loneliness, in the terrible space between us to remain silent any longer, even if the truth ruins me." She saw confusion flicker across his features, saw him lean forward slightly, as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing, and Eleanor felt tears begin to slip down her cheeks as she forced herself to continue. "You speak of giving me choice and freedom, of releasing me from a marriage I never chose, but you are wrong, Your Grace, so profoundly wrong that I must speak plainly, even though I know you married me for my fortune and nothing more." The words hung between them like a confession whispered in a cathedral, and she watched his face transform from confusion to something that looked almost like anguish as she pressed on. "I do not want your estate or your properties. I do not want freedom from this marriage or the independence you offer me. I want only you. I have wanted only you since the beginning, though I knew myself a fool for loving a man who saw me as nothing more than a means to save his ancestral home." His chair scraped back as he stood abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as though it were the only thing keeping him upright, and Eleanor saw in his eyes such a storm of emotion that she could not name all its components, pain and hope and disbelief warring for dominance as he said in a voice scraped raw, "Eleanor, you cannot mean—" But she interrupted him, unable to stop now that she had begun. "I mean that I love you, that I have loved you through all these terrible months of distance and silence, that I would rather live in a cottage with you than reign as Duchess of this entire estate without you, and if you send me away now it will not be because I chose freedom, but because you could not bear to keep a wife foolish enough to give her heart where it was not wanted." The silence that followed felt eternal, a suspension of time in which Eleanor's entire future hung in the balance, and then the Duke moved around the desk with such sudden purpose that she barely had time to draw breath before he was standing before her, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her sob aloud, and he said in a voice broken with wonder and pain, "Not wanted? Oh, my darling Eleanor, not wanted when I have loved you so desperately that I would give up everything I possess for your happiness, when I have spent months in torment believing myself unworthy of you, when the thought of you leaving nearly destroyed me." His thumbs brushed away her tears as his own eyes shone with moisture, and Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in the universe as he continued, "I married you for your fortune. Yes, that is the shameful truth I have carried like a stone upon my chest, but I would give it all back and more, would live in poverty if only you might look at me with love rather than duty, and I thought, by offering you freedom, I was giving you what you deserved, when all I truly wanted was to beg you to stay." The confession broke the last barrier between them, and Eleanor reached up to cover his hands with her own, their faces inches apart, both trembling with the enormity of what they had nearly lost and what they might yet gain. And in that moment, the weight of months of misunderstanding lifted like fog before the sun, leaving only the crystal clarity of mutual love acknowledged at last. The space between them collapsed as the Duke pulled Eleanor into his arms with a desperation that spoke of months of denial, and she melted against him as though her body had been waiting for this moment since the very day they wed. Their first true embrace, shattering the careful distance they had both maintained for so long, and Eleanor felt his heart racing against her own as his hands moved from her face to her waist, drawing her closer still as though he feared she might vanish if he loosened his hold. "All these months," he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with emotion, "all these terrible months I watched you move through these halls like a ghost, so beautiful and so distant, and I told myself it was what you deserved, to be free of a husband who had taken such mercenary advantage of your circumstances, but every day without you was an agony I can scarcely describe." Eleanor pulled back just enough to look into his face, seeing there the tracks of tears he had not bothered to hide, and she reached up to trace the line of his jaw with trembling fingers, as she said, "I thought myself so foolish for loving you, for wanting more than the arrangement we had made, and I poured all that longing into the gardens and the household, because I could not pour it into your hands." He caught her fingers and pressed them to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers, and Eleanor saw in their depths such tenderness that she felt her breath catch. For this was the man she had glimpsed in fragments over these long months, the man who read poetry in quiet corners and defended her honor and held her hand through fevered nights, the man she had loved without hope of reciprocation. "I watched you tend those gardens," he confessed, "watched you bring beauty to every corner of Ashbourne, and I thought how fitting it was that you should make this cold place bloom when you had made my own frozen heart come alive again. But I believed myself unworthy of speaking such truths aloud." They stood there in the fading light of his study, holding each other as though they were the only two souls in existence, and Eleanor felt laughter bubble up through her tears at the terrible comedy of their mutual blindness, and when he looked at her with concern she explained through her tears, "We have been such fools, both of us, suffering in parallel, when we might have been happy all this time if either of us had possessed the courage to speak." His answering laugh was watery but genuine, and he pressed his forehead to hers as he said, "Then let us be fools no longer. Let us promise to speak truth to each other from this day forward, no matter how difficult or frightening it may be." Eleanor nodded, unable to form words past the emotion clogging her throat, and then his lips found hers in a kiss that was both gentle and desperate, a kiss that tasted of salt from their mingled tears, and held within it all the longing of the months they had wasted, and Eleanor responded with an ardor that surprised them both, her hands tangling in his hair as his arms tightened around her waist, and when they finally drew apart, they were both breathless and laughing and crying all at once. The estate papers lay forgotten on the desk beside them, irrelevant now in the face of what they had discovered, and the Duke drew Eleanor to the settee by the window where the last rays of sunset painted the room in gold and amber, and they sat together for the first time without the weight of misunderstanding between them, speaking in tumbling rushes of confession about every moment of loneliness, every instance of longing, every small gesture that had meant everything, and through it all their hands remained intertwined, as though they had found an anchor in each other after months adrift in separate storms, and as night fell over Ashbourne, they made their promises to begin again, truly this time, with honesty and courage, and the love that had somehow survived, despite every obstacle they had placed in its path. The morning after their confession dawned bright and clear, as though the heavens themselves celebrated the transformation that had occurred within Ashbourne's walls, and when Eleanor woke in her own chambers for what she somehow knew would be the last time, she found a note slipped beneath her door in the Duke's own hand, asking if she might join him for breakfast in the conservatory, a room they had never shared before, and her heart sang as she dressed with trembling fingers and made her way through halls that seemed suddenly lighter, warmer, as though the house itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. She found him there among the potted orange trees and climbing jasmine, a table laid for two in the gentle morning light, and when he saw her, his face transformed with such open joy that she had to press her hand to her chest at the beauty of it, for this was the man behind all the careful masks, and the man she had glimpsed in fragments but could now see whole and unguarded, and he crossed to her immediately and took her hands in his and kissed them with a reverence that made her blush, as he said, "I wanted our first morning to be different, to be a true beginning." They sat together and talked as they had never talked before, not the careful exchanges of polite strangers, but the intimate conversation of two souls discovering each other without barriers. And Eleanor learned that he wrote poetry in the early mornings, that he had dreams of improving the tenant cottages and establishing a school on the estate, that his mother had died when he was young, and he had grown up in the cold formality of his father's house and vowed never to replicate such emotional distance in his own family, a vow he had broken in their marriage through fear and shame. And as he spoke, Eleanor saw the depths she had always sensed were there, the complexity and tenderness that had been hidden beneath propriety's armor. She in turn shared her own dreams for the estate, her vision of gardens that would be open to the village on summer days, her love of music that she had suppressed in the silence of their distant marriage, her fear that she would never be more than her fortune to anyone, and he listened with such attention that she felt truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. And when she paused, he reached across the table to take her hand and said with quiet intensity, "You are everything, Eleanor. Everything I never dared hope for and everything I do not deserve, and I will spend every day of our lives ensuring you know your worth has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with who you are." The hours passed like minutes as they talked, and when Mrs. Henderson came to check on them, she found them still there in the afternoon light, their breakfast long cold but their hands still joined across the table, and the housekeeper withdrew with tears in her eyes and spread word through the household that the master and mistress had finally found their way to each other, and the staff moved through their duties with lighter hearts, for they had all suffered watching the quiet tragedy of their lonely marriage. That evening Eleanor did not return to her separate chambers, but instead walked with the Duke through the halls to the master's suite, her hand in his, her heart racing with anticipation and nervousness and joy all mingled together. And when he closed the door behind them and drew her into his arms, she felt the last walls between them crumble into dust, and they discovered each other with a tenderness that spoke of love rather than duty, of choice rather than obligation, and Eleanor learned that physical intimacy could be an extension of emotional connection rather than a separate transaction, and in the darkness broken only by firelight, they whispered confessions and promises and plans for the future they would build together. And when she finally fell asleep in his arms, she felt for the first time since her wedding day that she had truly come home. The days following their reunion were suffused with a joy that transformed Ashbourne from its foundation to its rooftops. Yet, as the initial euphoria settled into something deeper and more sustainable, Eleanor and the Duke found themselves confronting the uncomfortable reality of how their marriage had begun. And one evening, as they sat together in the library, the fire crackling softly between them, Eleanor raised the subject that had been weighing on her heart, saying quietly, "We must speak of it, you know, of how we came to be married. For I fear if we do not address this honestly, it will always stand between us like a shadow." The Duke's expression grew troubled, and he set down the book he had been reading to turn his full attention to her, his eyes dark with the guilt that she had come to recognize would not be easily dismissed, and he said, "I married you for your fortune, Eleanor, a truth so mercenary and shameful that I can scarcely bear to speak it aloud. And though I have come to love you beyond all reason, I cannot change the fact that I entered our union with the basest of motivations." Eleanor reached for his hand, holding it between both of hers as she chose her words carefully, for she understood that this guilt was a burden he had carried far too long, and she said, "You married me for my fortune, this is true, but I married you knowing this, and I made that choice with open eyes, and while the months of distance between us were painful, I do not regret the decision that brought me to Ashbourne, that brought me to you." They talked long into the night, examining the foundations of their marriage with the honesty they had promised each other, and the Duke confessed how the shame had poisoned his every interaction with her, how he had believed himself unworthy of her regard, and had therefore denied himself the very thing he wanted most, and Eleanor in turn revealed how she had told herself that loving him was foolish, but had been unable to stop her heart from hoping. And as they spoke, she saw a new possibility emerging from their shared pain, a way to transform what had been wounded into something purposeful and healing. "What if," she said slowly, the idea taking shape even as she voiced it, "what if we used our experience to help others who find themselves in similar circumstances, young couples forced into arrangements by necessity who might benefit from knowing that such beginnings need not determine the ending?" The Duke looked at her with dawning understanding, his expression shifting from melancholy to something approaching hope, and he said, "You mean to open Ashbourne to others like us, to offer guidance and perhaps a different model than the cold distance we initially chose?" Eleanor nodded, her excitement building as the vision clarified, and she described how they might invite young couples to stay at the estate, to see how partnership and respect could coexist even within arranged marriages, to learn from their mistakes and their eventual triumph. And as she spoke, the Duke's face transformed with purpose, for here was a way to redeem the shame he carried, to ensure that others did not suffer as they had suffered. In the weeks that followed, they began to quietly extend invitations to couples they knew or heard of, who had entered into marriages of convenience, offering the hospitality of Ashbourne and the wisdom born of their own journey, and the estate that had once echoed with loneliness became a haven for those seeking to build genuine connection within the structures of duty and obligation. And Eleanor found that in helping others navigate the treacherous waters they had survived, her own wounds continued to heal. And the Duke discovered that in speaking honestly about his failures and his redemption, the crushing weight of guilt gradually lightened, replaced by the satisfaction of purpose shared with the woman he loved. The return to society came with the spring season, when invitations to balls and dinners and garden parties could no longer be politely declined, and though Eleanor felt a tremor of apprehension at facing the world that had whispered about her marriage with such knowing cruelty, she found courage in the Duke's hand, clasped firmly around hers, as their carriage rolled toward the Marchioness of Westmore's ball, the first grand social event they would attend since their transformation. The moment they entered the ballroom, all conversation seemed to pause, and Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them, assessing and judging and searching for confirmation of the gossip that had sustained drawing rooms for months. But the Duke did not release her hand, and when he looked down at her, his expression held such open tenderness that she saw several matrons lean together in startled whispers. For this was not the cold formality that society had expected from the Duke of Ashbourne and his purchased bride. He led her onto the dance floor with a pride that needed no words, his arm around her waist possessive and protective, and as they moved together through the figures of the waltz, Eleanor saw in his eyes the reflection of her own joy, and she understood that this dance was nothing like their wedding ball, where duty had held them in rigid separation, for now they moved as one, their bodies in perfect accord as their hearts had finally become. Lady Hartwick, who had been among the cruelest gossips, approached them during the interval with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and made some arch comment about how marriage seemed to agree with them after all, and Eleanor braced herself for the Duke's polite deflection. But instead, he looked at the woman with cool directness and said, "Marriage agrees with me because I had the extraordinary fortune to marry a woman of remarkable grace and patience, who somehow saw fit to love a man who initially did not deserve her regard, and I consider myself the most blessed of men to call her my wife." And the sincerity in his voice silenced Lady Hartwick completely and sent ripples of astonishment through those near enough to overhear. Throughout the evening he remained at Eleanor's side, his attention never wavering, his affection visible in every glance and touch, and she felt herself blooming under the warmth of his open devotion, her confidence growing as she realized that she need no longer hide her love or pretend to indifference, for he had claimed her publicly as thoroughly as he had claimed her privately in the intimacy of their chambers. Later they stood together near the garden doors, taking a moment of quiet amid the social whirl, and Eleanor overheard two young gentlemen discussing arranged marriages, one saying with cynical bitterness that such unions could never lead to genuine feeling. And before Eleanor could respond, the Duke turned to them and said with quiet conviction, "You are mistaken, for I entered my marriage with the worst of intentions, and found in my wife a depth of love I never imagined possible. And while I cannot recommend beginning as I did, I can attest that how a marriage begins need not determine how it continues, if both parties have the courage to be honest and the grace to forgive." And the young men listened with expressions of startled respect, and Eleanor's heart swelled with love for this man who could speak so openly of his own failures in service of a larger truth. As their carriage carried them home through the moonlit countryside, the Duke drew her close against his side and murmured against her hair, "Did you see how they looked at us? How they could not reconcile the gossip they had cherished with the reality before their eyes?" And Eleanor smiled and replied, "Let them wonder. Let them see that we have found something they cannot diminish with their whispers." And they rode the rest of the way in contented silence, secure in the knowledge that society's opinion mattered far less than the truth they had built together. And when they reached Ashbourne and walked together up the stairs to their shared chambers, Eleanor reflected that the transformation visible to the world was merely the shadow of the profound change that had occurred in their hearts, and that no ballroom performance could capture the quiet miracle of two lonely souls who had finally found their way home to each other. The unsigned estate transfer documents remained in the Duke's study for several weeks after their reconciliation, lying in a drawer where both could see them but neither mentioned, until one quiet afternoon, when Eleanor entered to find her husband standing at his desk with the papers spread before him, his expression thoughtful and serious, and when he looked up at her approach he said without preamble, "These documents represent something I still believe to be right, Eleanor, though perhaps not in the way I originally intended." And she moved to stand beside him, looking down at the legal language that would have given her everything and left him with almost nothing. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his, as he explained that while the papers had been drawn up in a moment of desperate guilt and self-punishment, he still wanted her to have full legal control of the estate, not because he doubted her love or sought to assuage his conscience, but because he genuinely believed she deserved the security and power that such ownership would provide, saying, "You restored Ashbourne with your fortune, you have managed it with wisdom and grace, and it seems only just that the law should recognize what reality already demonstrates, that you are the true heart of this place." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the sincerity in his voice, but she shook her head slowly and said, "I understand what you are offering and why, and I love you all the more for your desire to give me this security, but I cannot accept these papers as written, for they represent a division between us that no longer exists, a separation of interests that contradicts everything we have built together." And she watched his face carefully as she continued, "What if instead we drew up new documents, papers that establish us as equal partners in law as we are in life, joint ownership that recognizes both our contributions and our shared commitment to Ashbourne's future?" The Duke's expression transformed with something like wonder, and he gripped her hands more tightly as he said, "You would do this? You would bind yourself legally to a partnership with me when you could have sole control and when you could protect yourself from any future disaster?" And Eleanor smiled through her tears and replied, "I would bind myself to you in any way possible, for we are already bound in every way that matters, and I want the world to see that we stand together not from necessity but from choice." They summoned the solicitor that very afternoon, and as they worked together to draft new papers establishing joint ownership of the Ashbourne estate, Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her, for this legal document would reflect the truth of their marriage in a way the original transfer never could, recognizing both partners as equals, with equal claim to the land they had rebuilt together and the life they were creating within its boundaries. When the papers were finally ready for signing several days later, the Duke insisted on gathering the household staff to witness the moment, saying that these people who had watched their painful journey from cold formality to genuine love deserved to see this symbolic culmination, and so in the great hall with Mrs. Davies and Harrison, and all the servants who had served them through the difficult months, Eleanor and the Duke signed their names side by side, their signatures intertwining on the page as their lives had intertwined in reality. After the documents were witnessed and sealed, the Duke raised his glass in a toast, saying to the assembled staff, "You have all witnessed the transformation of this house from a place of loneliness to a home filled with love, and you have been patient with your master and mistress as we found our way to each other. And now we ask you to witness this legal recognition of what our hearts have already claimed, that we are partners in all things, that Ashbourne belongs to both of us equally, and that whatever future we build here will be built together." And the staff erupted in genuine celebration, their faces reflecting the joy of servants who had truly cared for the welfare of those they served. And as Eleanor looked around at these people who had become like family, and then at her husband, whose eyes shone with love and pride. She understood that this moment was not merely about legal documents or property rights, but about the public declaration of a private truth, the acknowledgement before witnesses that two people who had begun in darkness had found their way to light, and that they would face whatever came next, not as master and dependent, or even as duke and duchess, but as true partners, bound by love and choice and mutual respect. The papers they had signed merely confirming what their hearts had already made irrevocably true. The year that followed their legal partnership unfolded like the turning of seasons in a garden, carefully tended, each month bringing new growth and deeper roots to the love that had finally been allowed to flourish between them. And when spring arrived with its promise of renewal, the Duke and Eleanor worked side by side in the extensive gardens, their hands dark with soil as they planted roses and lavender and all manner of flowering things, and Eleanor would never forget the sight of her husband kneeling in the earth beside her, his fine coat discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled up. Laughing as he confessed he had never touched garden soil before in his life, but found unexpected peace in the work, and she taught him how to judge the depth of planting and the spacing of bulbs, and they created together a riot of color that would bloom through the coming months as testimony to their partnership. Summer brought the first of what would become an annual tradition, when they opened Ashbourne's doors to three young couples trapped in arranged marriages, much like their own had been, and Eleanor watched her husband speak with profound honesty to these strangers about his own mistakes and the path he had walked, from mercenary intention to genuine love, and she saw how his words gave hope to women who had believed themselves nothing more than commodities, and to men who had thought themselves condemned to lives of comfortable emptiness. And together she and the Duke created an atmosphere where honesty could flourish, and where couples could begin to see each other as potential partners rather than merely contractual obligations. And by summer's end, two of the three couples departed with visible transformations in how they looked at each other, and Eleanor felt her heart swell with gratitude that their pain had been transmuted into something that could ease the suffering of others. Autumn arrived with golden light and cooling air, and on the anniversary of their wedding day the Duke led Eleanor to the small chapel on the estate grounds where they had spoken their original vows in cold formality, and there, in the presence of only Mrs. Davies and Harrison as witnesses, they spoke new vows to each other, promises made not from duty or desperation, but from the deep certainty of tested love, and Eleanor's voice trembled as she pledged herself to this man who had given her everything when she had nothing, and the Duke's eyes shone with tears as he promised to spend every remaining day of his life proving himself worthy of the grace she had shown him. And when they kissed in that quiet chapel, Eleanor tasted salt from both their tears and knew that these vows held a sacredness their first wedding had entirely lacked. Winter brought the deepest gift of all when Eleanor discovered she was with child, and she remembered the moment of telling her husband how he had gone very still and then gathered her into his arms with such tender reverence, his hand coming to rest gently on her still flat belly as he whispered that he had never imagined he would be given such a blessing, that he had thought his mistakes would cost him any chance at a true family. And Eleanor held him close and assured him that their child would be born into love, not obligation, into a home filled with warmth rather than cold formality. And as snow fell softly outside their windows, and they sat together before the fire in their shared chambers, Eleanor reflected that the passage of these seasons had transformed not just their relationship, but their very understanding of what marriage could be, and she knew with quiet certainty that every future season would only deepen the extraordinary gift they had discovered in each other. This love that had grown from the most barren soil into something beautiful and lasting, and entirely their own. 5 years had passed since that transformative winter, when Eleanor and the Duke had finally spoken the truth that set them both free, and Ashbourne had become something neither of them could have imagined in those early days of cold formality and painful distance, transformed from a grand but empty estate into a home that radiated warmth and life, and the kind of happiness that comes only from love that has been tested and proven true. The gardens Eleanor had planted in that first spring of their genuine partnership had matured into breathtaking beauty, roses climbing the south wall in profusion and lavender lining the walking paths with purple abundance, and it was in these gardens that their 2 children spent their days under the watchful eye of their devoted nurse. Little Thomas, who had just turned 4, racing between the flower beds with his wooden sword, while his sister, Catherine, not yet 2, toddled after him with determined steps and delighted laughter. The Duke stood at the library window watching his children play, and Eleanor knew without asking that he was thinking about how close they had come to missing all of this, how easily pride and pain and self-imposed distance might have cost them not just each other, but these beautiful souls who now filled their days with joy and purpose. And she saw him touch his hand to the glass as Thomas fell, and Catherine stopped her pursuit to toddle over and pat her brother's head in comfort, and their innate kindness toward each other, a reflection of the love that now permeated every corner of their home. Eleanor crossed the room to stand beside her husband, slipping her hand into his as she had done countless times over these years, and he turned to her with that look that still made her heart quicken, the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his good fortune and who treasures every moment with an intensity born of having almost lost everything that matters. They had framed the original estate transfer documents and hung them in the Duke's study, not as a reminder of pain, but as a testament to the moment when love had proven stronger than pride, when her husband had been willing to give her everything because he loved her enough to let her go. And sometimes when Eleanor passed that frame, she would stop and remember her own trembling refusal, her confession that she wanted him more than security or freedom or anything the world might offer, and she would marvel at the courage it had taken for both of them to speak truth after so many months of silence. The legacy of their transformation extended far beyond their own happiness, for Ashbourne had become known throughout the county as a place where struggling couples could find guidance and hope, where the Duke and Duchess shared their story with unflinching honesty and helped others navigate the difficult path, from arrangement to genuine affection, and over the years they had watched dozens of couples arrive at their door with the same look of quiet desperation Eleanor remembered from her own early days of marriage, and they had seen many of those same couples depart with something like light beginning to dawn in their eyes, the first tentative hope that perhaps their stories too might transform from obligation into love. The Duke pulled Eleanor closer as they watched their children, and she leaned into his warmth, thinking about how suffering had indeed led them to this joy, how the cold formality of their beginning had somehow made the warmth of their present all the more precious, and she understood now that the pain they had endured had not been meaningless, but had shaped them both into people capable of appreciating the extraordinary gift of genuine partnership, of love freely given and gratefully received. And as Thomas helped his sister to her feet, and both children looked up at the library window to wave at their parents, Eleanor felt her heart overflow with gratitude for every difficult moment that had led them to this perfect afternoon, this life that had bloomed from the most unpromising soil into something more beautiful than she had ever dared to dream. Evening descended on Ashbourne with that peculiar golden quality that autumn brings, and the Duke and Eleanor walked together through the gardens she had first planted in hope, and he had later tended in love, their children safely in the nursery, being prepared for bed by their devoted nurse, and as they moved between the rose beds that had grown wild and glorious over the years, Eleanor felt her husband's hand tighten around hers and knew he was thinking, as she so often did, about the miracle of their transformation, about how close they had come to spending their entire lives in that cold formality that had marked their beginning. They settled on the stone bench beneath the ancient oak, where Eleanor had once sat alone, contemplating the bleakness of her future, and the Duke turned to her with that expression of wondering gratitude that still appeared on his face when he looked at her, as though he could not quite believe she was real and present, and he spoke softly about how their suffering had not been without purpose, how the pain of those early months had taught them both the value of what they now possessed, and Eleanor nodded because she understood that the joy she felt in their present life was made somehow deeper and richer by the memory of what they had endured to reach it. Dear listener, perhaps you have found yourself in circumstances that feel cold and transactional. Perhaps you have wondered whether love can truly grow from the most barren soil, or whether some beginnings are too compromised to ever transform into something beautiful. And I would have you know that the story of the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne stands as testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human heart, to its capacity for transformation even when all seems lost, for their marriage began in the worst possible way with mercenary intention on one side and resigned despair on the other, yet through patience and vulnerability and the courage to speak truth, even when that truth felt impossibly frightening, They discovered that love is not diminished by difficult origins, but can in fact be strengthened by them, made more precious by the very obstacles that might have destroyed it. The lesson of their story is not that wealth or title or security matters less than we think, but rather that our worth as human beings transcends entirely what we possess or what we can offer in material terms, that the Duke learned to value Eleanor, not despite losing her fortune, but because losing it freed him to see her truly, and Eleanor learned that she was worthy of love not because of what she brought to the marriage, but simply because of who she was. And this understanding transformed them both into people capable of genuine partnership, of love that asks nothing and gives everything, of devotion that grows deeper with each passing season. So if you find yourself trapped in circumstances that feel immutable, if you believe that your beginning has determined your ending, or that the mistakes of the past have foreclosed the possibility of future joy, take heart from their example and know that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to be vulnerable, patient enough to allow love to grow in its own time, and honest enough to speak the truth that lives in their hearts. And may you find in your own life the courage to choose love over pride, connection over isolation, and hope over despair. And may you rest tonight knowing that the worst beginnings can indeed lead to the most beautiful endings, that suffering can be transmuted into joy, and that love freely given and gratefully received is the greatest treasure any human heart can know. This story comes to you from Tales of Transformation, where we believe in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds and the capacity of the human spirit to find light in the darkest places. And if this story has touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs to hear that their story too can transform, that their pain too can lead to unexpected joy, and that love is always worth the courage it takes to reach for it.